If you're leaving, please do. Okay, let's carry on. Item 17. This is the presentation by the Commission on the report on the rights of passengers in bus and coach transport. So, I'll give the floor first of all to the Commission. Mr. Coulson, good morning, welcome to you. You have around 10 minutes. He'll be representing his report on the implementation of Regulation 181/2011 on the rights of passengers in bus and coach transport. I'd ask him if he can just say a few words what the Commission's initiative is on these passenger rights as far as multimodal transport is concerned. The public consultation is open, will be till the 25th of May. And I think it's important that the Commission explain a little as to what it intends to do there and what the timetable is. The Transport Committee would very much like easy access for citizens to public transport, as well as obviously guarantees for their rights. So we're very much interested. We're very much interested in making sure that that facility of access is guaranteed, especially for people with reduced mobility. That really is a priority for our committee. So you have the floor, sir. Over to you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Le règlement dont...
Thank you much indeed, Madam Chair. This is the last part of the most recent part of the passenger rights regulation after the other modes of passenger transport. As you know, the EU is the only region of the world where passengers have very broad rights irrespective of the mode of transport. After 2.5 years now of this regulation being enforced, I think we can say, and I think this is the most important conclusion, that it is working well. It's been accepted by transporters themselves. They actually use this to promote their modes of transport. They apply the various provisions, and they see passengers see this as a very useful tool. All member states have actually designated a body to implement the regulation. They've adopted laws vis-à-vis any sanctions, penalties that we applied if there are any infringements of the regulation. Criticism that might be formulated wouldn't necessarily come from the implementation of the regulation, but rather from some of the provisions therein. Most of the provisions of the regulation are limited to services over 250 kilometers. That is criticized by consumer associations. Plus, member states can exempt purely national services up to the 28th of February 2021, and 12 member states have actually used those exemptions up to 28th of February 2017. We don't yet know who will be extending that up to 2021, 28th of February, but 2 have said that they would to date. So these are real limits within the regulation, but they are from the provisions therein. The regulation doesn't impose anything on member states. All they have to do is to designate a road station, travel station with access facility for people with reduced mobility. By designating these bus coach terminals, well, some have gone above and beyond that. Others have just stuck to the strict provisions of the regulation. As far as the passengers' rights are concerned, well, there are still concerns here. Some member states here have launched very useful activities, but others have done nothing. The new information campaign from the Commission is going to focus on social networks, and that hopefully will have a positive impact on the understanding of this regulation. As you know, it's obviously younger people that are taking long-distance coaches because obviously they cost less. You asked me just to say a few words on the initiative on passengers' rights, intermodal transport. The roadmap was actually published by the Commission, and the public consultation, that's ongoing. Obviously, it's too early to give you any details on this initiative. Obviously, the specific arrangements will be decided on after we've done the impact assessment. The following elements, I think, though, can at this point in time be highlighted. First of all, I think we see increasingly intermodal transport services sold as such, and for which various modes of transport are used one after the other. So you have one ticket, one single ticket, but you use different types of transport one after the other. Most frequently, we see air-rail combinations. A very clear example here, Brussels, from Brussels Midi station, or rail and coach. But there are other combinations, for example, air-coach. That's very common in Spain, rail ferry and coach and ferry. These sorts of products, I think, are going to be increasing in importance over the next few years. So this regulation, the regulations which are looked at per mode of transport, they, by their nature, weren't thought of for these new services, which is obviously damaging for passengers when they want to see sort of a link between various modes of transport. Also, I think we have to have a think about providing passengers with the right to recourse where they miss their connection, where the passenger themselves have organized that specific trip by taking two different modes of transport. And then finally, as you said, the question of people with disabilities, passengers with disabilities, reduced mobility, I think there we should be looking more at that in the Commission in the two cases you've mentioned. This initiative, I think, should be up and running in 2018, towards the end of next year rather than the beginning. So 2018. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair, and thank you, members, for listening.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll open the debate now with any MEP that would like to take the floor. Mr. Bach.
Monsieur Bach, c'est à vous.
Sorry. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Coulson, for that presentation. I'll carry on in German. My notes are in German, that's why. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Commission for that presentation and the report. I think the report shows that there are some points where we can make improvement, even though we do have good implementation, as Mr. Coulson has said. What we've confirmed, though, well, we haven't had all the data, and what I've seen is that there is a lack of data connecting things together, and for these terminals, from the various tables, very few infringements have been handed down. And because of this lack of data, I think we see that the companies, the transport providers, that they've told passengers they don't need to register any of these sorts of cases. We need to improve things there. One question, for example, in Spain, there are so many complaints, and the penalties, okay, that's I understand that, but some countries haven't put forward any data, whereas in Spain, 1,200 complaints. So that's my question to the Commission. Do you have any understanding as to why this is the case? Secondly, the various exceptions from the regulation, we need to find a solution there. And passengers might not understand why these exemptions don't apply necessarily to public transport, why these countries can have the exemptions up to 2020. I think we need to have an in-depth discussion on that again. The information, I think, is that, well, the information on passenger rights came quite late. We've seen the initiatives over the past few months and past few years. I don't think we can yet evaluate. I think the information in member states themselves is still lacking. I mean, lots of people know the rights that you have as air passengers, but not necessarily when you're a rail or bus or coach passenger. For people with disabilities, I think we do need to find very quick solutions there, especially for these bus terminals. There, member states, I think, have to make an effort. And as you said, Mr. Coulson, something is going to be happening there for the end of the 2018. That's still quite a way away. And we always know that things last longer, take longer than we say they will. So, those were the points, the general points I wanted to raise that I didn't see from the consumer side of things. The possibility to complain, I don't think, is necessarily well known. And I think in many member states, you don't actually have any real mediation body. They've not been designated as to where they can come to a resolution. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Bach. Mr. Ziller.
Jā, paldies, priekšsēdētājs kundze. Paldies arī Eiropas komisijai par šo ziņojumu. Man ir faktiski divi jautājumi.
Thank you very much indeed. I have two questions for you. Commission, do you have any information on these countries that are not going to be using these rights by February? Any progress there, any developments? And are you planning any investment? Or are we still at the same level as when the regulation was brought in? You also talked about social media. Passengers can get more information from social media. Is that the case already, or are you planning to do something there? Because I think it'd be very important that passengers do have the right information before they even start to decide, before you start to bring this measure in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Commission. I need to say at the outset that immediately after I finish my remarks and questions, I will have to leave to ITRE because I have a file there. So it's not that I would not be interested in the answers, but I have to go and colleagues will take note. Thanks very much indeed for the information. I must say that having read only the report and not having looked yesterday into the regulation, I'm not sure whether there is a justification for saying that so far only 2 member states have asked for the exemption as if we are still waiting after the 28th of February 2017 that others still may ask. So is there a provision which gives, still some time? Because my understanding that would be that not so far, but only 2 member states have asked for the exemption, and that's it. It's a fait accompli, and I would appreciate if we could be informed which are these 2 member states. Secondly, in terms of evaluation of the implementation of the regulation, is there something, bearing in mind that the Commission in autumn will come with new legislation which will concern this sector, this business, that would draw as conclusions which will be reflected in this new legislation, though of course I understand that the nature of that will be different, but still passenger rights will be affected. Thirdly, in terms of information, I must say that people do move around Europe, and I move around, but and I even use buses, but I really don't see at the bus stations and elsewhere at least the information that we are provided with at airports in terms of passengers. So how is the Commission vis-à-vis the Member States addressing that issue? And the final point would be, if among the Member States which are, let's say, experiencing the highest number of complaints, and I think that those would be Spain, Germany, my own country, is it because, the passenger rights are really that abused, or is it that the system just functions, that the level of information and the performance of the relevant authority is up to the expectation? So which of the two, and what is the Commission doing vis-à-vis the Member States, where eventually the analysis shows that in fact it is not that the services would be that superb, but to the poor, because of the reason of poor functioning of the relevant competent authority. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Telitschka.
Thank you very much, Mr. Telitschka. Mr. Cramer. Thank you very much indeed for the presentation. I just don't understand, though. Commission, you don't see any need to review this regulation because you have these passenger rights for bus, you have this unfair competition. It's the Commission, the EU, deciding that each train had to pay a fee per kilometre, but not for buses. That's not the case in Germany. So rail has to pay all of this. That's the first point you'd have to correct. Secondly, distances. For rail, we decided long distance. That's normally 50 kilometres, irrespective of whether you go cross-border or not. For buses, from 250 kilometres, only within one country. So you could say, Luxembourg, this doesn't play a role, because I think within the country you don't have any, you can't go more than 250 kilometres. So why would Luxembourg be excluded? You have to correct that. This is the experience we have. Even though we decided this 10 years ago that long-distance buses weren't as important, not in Germany, in other countries maybe, we do have to learn from our experience. A decisive point, I think, we don't have very much information. Why is that? Well, in the rail regulation it says that rail companies have to publish, paragraph 3, Article 28, Article 28, they have to publish the numbers of complaints that have been handed in and resolved, how long they took. So you have a clear paragraph there for rail, but you don't have that in the bus regulation. Why shouldn't it be in there? So we at least know that we have fair competition. We don't have very much data. There's not many complaints for the bus sector. So I think the least you could do in the review, in the revised regulation, is to have this put in, and then we'd know what has to be done. I have information vis-à-vis 2015, baggage that's been stolen or damaged has gone up by 25%. Alarming number. If you look at air transport or whatever, you know, we would be up in arms, but not necessarily here. So things have to be changed there. This unfair competition is carrying on. I think we do need to revise things so that we at least have a fair playing field, a level playing field. Rail, obviously, we started there with lots of different regulations. Not all have been implemented. Air, obviously, you have the 5-hour period, and then the ECJ say, no, it has to be after 3 hours. So I would therefore ask you, the Commission, to revise this. And if you don't have the experience, well, let's go on a coach over and beyond 50 kilometres and see how you're treated, how many minutes you're late, whether you can make a complaint, all that information. You know, all the information passengers should have. But I think you need that experience yourself. We all need to have this experience, and then we can see what comes out of all of that. And Mr. Bach is completely correct. We need fair competition, at least as far as information is concerned, and that's not what we have at the moment. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Cramer. Ms. Meissner. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commission. Well, lots of questions have already been asked, but I negotiated this for our group. It wasn't 10 years ago, it was 8 years ago. I think it was 2009. Well, it's really disappointing. Well, there were regulations for other modes of transport, but not for bus passengers. So it's really disappointing if not everything has been implemented. We had that trilogue quite recently, but we didn't get very far because member states didn't want to. This 250 kilometre wasn't our idea, but it's the only thing that member states wanted. They wanted even further. Very specific question. Mr. Telichka asked which countries asked for those exemptions, and then there were some member states that had national bus passenger rights, others didn't. For those that didn't, maybe that they've had more problems implementing this.
Madame Foster, c'est à vous.
Mrs. Foster.
Yeah, thanks. Just a brief point, because I think a number of us, including Mrs. Meissner, remember some of the conversations we had here, and I think some of the challenges. I don't think anything's deliberate, particularly on anybody's part. Clearly, if you've got a regulation laid down, it is up to the member states to make sure that they implement it. And just making another regulation because we don't think we're getting the results by good implementation, I don't think is the right way forward. But I do remember, for those colleagues who weren't here at the time, it is very difficult when you're differentiating between a bus journey, i.e. you're on the bus, and some countries the bus journeys do go longer, further than others, as opposed to a coach journey. And, when you've got the buses sitting in traffic, for hours and hours and hours, which is quite often the case on motorways or whatever going round to different towns, there were also challenges there as to how you then actually dealt with that. So I think it's useful that the Commission have come today, and that certainly some of these points can be raised. And it might probably, and clearly there's a problem, I think, with them getting information from some of the member states in terms of where the problems are and what they've done to address it. But I think the point Chairman makes on passengers with reduced mobility, as you said, you need to work on that. And I think that's something that is concrete. I think you can seriously work towards improving with member states. But in the meantime, certainly, from my point of view, thanks for coming in and giving us an update. But it would be useful if you could come in perhaps with some answers. Not that anybody's asking to have more regulation, but perhaps give us a few more answers as to how you think you can implement this better with the member states. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you much indeed, Mrs. Foster. I'll give the floor back to Mr. Coulson, if you can try and answer all of those questions.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. These penalties, it's a problem we always see in passenger rights and generally speaking in European legislation, member states do have a very large room for manoeuvre in texts drawn up. What is imposed on them is to have penalties, effective and proportionate dissuasive penalties. So this allows the legal structure of the member states. It leaves them a huge room for manoeuvre. That means there are a lot of different penalties. So we are trying to work on this in the air sector, but it's not easy. And that explains, I think, why some member states have penalties imposed every single time they see an infringement, whereas other countries, on the other hand, they'd rather have a more an overview of what's happening, impose fewer, maybe higher infringements, or maybe not have infringements fines, but do something else. So if you look at the table, it shows there are huge differences. But it's very difficult for the Commission to act in any specific way on this point. In Spain, well, the explanation here is twofold. Coach transport there is widespread in Spain, more I think than in other countries, long-distance coach journeys. That's been there for many years. Secondly, the control implementation authorities sometimes have more tasks than just the regulation themselves. That's the case for Spain. So that should be a footnote, I think, in the report. Penalties, as reported, are penalties that, or complaints that have been made to the authority, but they might cover something a bit vaster than the actual regulation. And that's why I think in Spain we do have a huge number of complaints and penalties imposed. On these exemptions, well, we will have to think about this. Just to say, though, we have a regulation which came into force 2.5 years ago. That's not a very long time ago to actually want to start revising it. What we do see is that we'll show member states that things have happened very quickly, to ask them whether they're going to carry on exempting their national services or not. We'll give them a bit more time. To that question, it's Portugal and Estonia who've indicated they want to exempt. Others maybe will have to, but they'll have to do that very soon. These terminals, obviously, there's a problem there. The text is drawn up in such a way that it is legally very difficult to impose on a member state more than one terminal. Some member states have made more progress than others, that's true. The information campaign from the Commission, it's based on social networks. That's a decision that was taken. It was a choice that was taken to try and have an impact on road transport regulation, because increasingly it's younger people that take the coach rather than the train. Coaches are cheaper for young people, and that's why they take them more than the train. So an information campaign on social networks, I think that will have an impact where it's supposed to. Information in general, we've come up with posters and with leaflets. You don't find them everywhere, that's true. There's no obligation for these bus and coach terminals to put anything up. We try and encourage them to display them, to make sure that these brochures are handed out as much as possible, but it doesn't always happen. The difference, as mentioned by Mr. Cramer, between the exemptions in the coach and rail, well, here, I think you're looking more at the German situation. That's true in Germany. Rail isn't exempted. That was a choice by the German government. But if you look elsewhere in Europe, there you do see in rail, you do see quite a few more exemptions than in coach, many more. Rail companies have the possibility to exclude national services, and that's been used by, I think, almost all member states in the eastern part of Europe, and also by the United Kingdom. So the exemption situation, if you look at these two modes, isn't as unfavourable to the coach sector that you might think vis-a-vis the rail sector. And this is one of the things when we're looking at in the review of the rail regulation that we would like to come back to. So, Madam Chair, I think that's basically what I had on the questions raised.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you much indeed. Commission, Mr. Cramer, you have a comment. Just on one point, you didn't say correctly. Commission and Council for international journeys. Here in Parliament, we were all in agreement. You go to Aachen, Cologne to Aachen, 2 hours. You don't get a 2 hours delay. You don't get any penalty. But if it goes to Liège and then Brussels, there is, then you do. That was a breakthrough. So I think there's a huge distinction. It's not necessarily a national issue. It's a European law, i.e., passengers on long distance trains do have a claim to compensation.
Simplement, Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, trust me, in current legislation, member states do not have to apply the regulation to national rail journeys. Some of them, too many we would say, have actually used that derogation. Thank you much indeed. Thank you. Let's carry on. I think this is one of the key points we'll have to look at. We know we have a legislative text that will be ready very soon. So we'll be up to what we do with the hearings, the commission, and the committee rather. We will have to have a panel and see what's having a look at in Europe and see how countries compare. Mr. Macron's reform in the bus sector has been implemented in France, and sometimes it's not necessarily profitable. So we'll have to have a look at how profits are affected, specific investments. Colleagues, we are very much ahead of time at the moment. I think we'll be finishing very soon. So I'll suspend things now until 11 o'clock, and that will allow us to make sure our colleagues are here at 11 o'clock, because we have an exchange of view with our coordinators from RTT. So we'll see each other again 10T. We'll see each other again at 11 o'clock. Please make sure you're back by then. Thank you.